Hello, I'm Ronald, Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including from those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewer, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and to share your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune Society. Today we're going to have a great show talking about decarcerating families and communities. And we have two dynamic guests. Brittany Smith, a teacher at the Fortune Society, and Sharon Richardson, a reentry specialist at Steps to End Family Violence. So thank both of you ladies for being on both sides of the bars with us today.
Thank you for having
So I
us.
want
Thanks
to,
for having us.
yeah, it's my pleasure. So I want to share a little bit about your bio with the audience. So Sharon, to my immediate left, again, reentry specialist at Steps to End Family Violence, helps citizens with domestic violence involvement who are returning home to society after a period of incarceration. Sharon is also the founder and CEO of two organizations, Reentry Rocks and Just Soul Catering. Prior to that, Sharon was released in 2010 from serving 20 years to life for a domestic violence case. She currently is using her personal experience to inform her professional work, speaking at numerous organizations about issues related to domestic violence. She's also a writer, producer, actor, and I'm sure I can go on, all right, and has performed in multiple shows, including most recently, the Vagina Monologues. And she has a bachelor's degree in sociology. So again, thank you, Sharon, for being with us. And also Brittany Smith, to my far left. So Brittany, again, works as a teacher, Fortune Society, where she has been insistent that her students are not only socially aware, but also socially active, helping them to advocate for themselves and others like them. Brittany loves being in a classroom and is building a career in social services, and we're so proud that she is doing it at the Fortune Society. Prior to that, Brittany went to prison for almost 3 years, immediately enrolling in Boston University's prison education program, where she graduated with honors in 2014. Previously, Brittany helped combat violence or gang violence in Boston's Dorchester neighborhood while studying sociology and African American studies at Harvard University. So again, so the topic today, decarcerating families and communities. I mean, clearly based upon your experience and the work that you do, you're really informed about this particular topic. And so it's impacted you personally and it's impacted you through the work that you do. So Sharon, why don't I start with you and ask a question. How do we reduce people's interaction with the criminal justice system and begin to decarcerate our communities?
Well, I think that first people have to begin to understand that whole process and what that actually involves. And I believe also that in understanding that process, you have to also have a passion for it to be able to embrace it. Because other than that, you wouldn't be able to go far with the information. Using my personal experience as being an incarcerated person, I realize now that after doing 20 years in prison, that I didn't have to do those 20 years. Had I had another alternative at the time that I got arrested back in 1990, that it would have served well. When I went to prison, I left 2 small children at home. My daughter was 8 years old and my son was 2. They were left with my mom, who was already an elderly woman, to raise on her own with the hope that I was going to return back home, and that didn't happen. So every year we were counting on the criminal justice system to make it happen for us when I did my appeals, when I applied for clemency, and the doors never opened. Every time it looked like it was, it didn't happen. So when I now look after being released and realize that it served no purpose because I lost so much, did I really have to spend 20 years in prison? I realized that although my case was a domestic violence case and a life was taken, and I take responsibility for that, you know, because I'm huge on that, that I didn't have to spend 20 years in prison. And although I did and utilized it well by getting my associate's degree and my bachelor's degree, there was a lot taken from me, meaning that my children grew up without me.
Yes.
My mom, you know, spent a lot of money, you know, trying to make sure that my kids saw me every week, as far as paying the telephone bill from calls, making sure that I had packages, just making sure that I had everything that I would need. Was all of that necessary? Could I have gone into a program that would have better served for me in the end and make things better for everyone involved?
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
And it's really important for our viewers to get an understanding, like you said, convicted of a domestic violence related crime. We've talked about how as a society we need to look at how we need to address people that are victims, particularly women that are victims of domestic violence. We end up sending, like we did with you, someone to prison for an extensive amount of time. And as you said, the question is it necessary to do that? Are we increasing public safety by doing so? And a lot of times we don't really think about that.
Absolutely.
So thank you for sharing
You're
that
welcome.
personal story, and also how it impacted not just you, but again, decarcerating families and communities. So you shared how your family was directly impacted by that. So Brittany, same basic question for you. I mean, again, how do we go about decarcerating families and communities? And is, you know, you can, you know, share your experiences with us, you know, in as much as you feel, you know, able to do so.
So I'm not even sure where we begin. I guess it's part of the process and how we address the issues that affect people going to prison, number one. So education, resources, all of those become an issue. But once you're there, how do we maintain kind of family relations and unification in prison? I don't have any children, so for me, it was a little bit different than you, Sharon, but I do have a lot of siblings, and I have my parents, and I have nieces and nephews who, how do you explain to a 5-year-old that you're going to be gone for 3 years? What explanation do you give? The explanation we ended up giving was that I was in school. And I shared this story previously, but my nephew was probably 5 or 6 when I went to prison, and he came to visit me. And I had gotten recently moved from the prison to a pre-release. I wouldn't allow him to visit me in prison because I didn't want him to go through all of the metal detectors and get patted down and take off his little belt or whatever the case may be. I didn't think that that was okay for a 6-year-old. So for me, my sister agreed we wouldn't do that. We would tell him I was in school. So when I got moved to a minimum pre-release, no bars, no gates, so it was a better environment for family visits. And he came and we sat outside, and from where we were sitting outside, there was a parking lot. And at the end of the visit, when my sister and my dad tell him, you know, it's time to go, he's like, oh, Auntie Brittany, are you coming with me? And I said, no, baby, I have to stay in school. He was like, but why? The car is just right there, as he points to the car. And I couldn't think of an explanation to give him as to why I couldn't go with him. And I think the most difficult thing is how do we put the children in our lives in that situation where we have to explain to them like what this means or why you're gone for 3 years. I also, like you, my parents and my family, my siblings struggled with making sure there was money on the phone. I couldn't get packages. I was actually incarcerated in Massachusetts, not in New York, so you can't get packages. But money on the phone, money on my books, right? Coming to visit me when you have to travel several states over from New York to Massachusetts. All my family is still in New York. And that process was a difficult process, and there were times where they considered canceling visits because of the snow, and I'm like, my dad's on the highway already. Like, don't do this to me or to us. And there were times where, you know, our families weren't respected in the institutions, and that was also a difficult part of being in prison and seeing how your family is being mistreated, but not being able to do anything about it because they could just tell your visit to leave. It's at their discretion. Like, how do we process that? And I think that's a question that we need to begin to answer.
And we had a conversation previously about how dehumanizing incarceration can be, and it could be particularly so for women because women have unique experiences that men don't necessarily have. There was an issue about women being shackled, right, while pregnant, and there was also stories about women not having access to certain sanitary napkins and other things that women need. So I was talking with you about that, Brittany, but in your 20 years of incarceration, you know, what are some of the unique experiences and needs that women have that are incarcerated?
Right, so You know, you saying all that, it's like making me sweat because you take me right back to it. I mean, thinking about having to ask a male officer for sanitary napkins and have that conversation about, well, you just got some, Ms. Richardson, but I need more. Now, I'm standing there trying to explain to this male officer, you know, and then also even coming off of visits, you know, being strip searched. And the whole process of having to squat and I mean, like, you are being exposed. It's like you're being a victim again. And in my case, you know, having a domestic violence case, it was like I was re-victimized. Everything that I went through, that whole process is just like Brittany said, it's dehumanizing. And can never be forgotten.
And Brittany, you alluded to the same thing,
same
and,
thing coming off
you had
of a
not had the
visit.
conversation with Sharon, so you want to share the experience?
It is. It's very degrading, and I found sometimes, and we would make complaints about it, the extent to what these officers would say to us. A friend of mine had said to me that the officer told her, "I want to see pink," when she had to strip and squat coming off of a visit. How degrading is that? Like, you come probably from this really high place of being with your family. Visits are 3 hours where I was, so your family is traveling hours to come, more hours to come see you than the actual visit exists. And you come from this really good place, and then that's what you go back to. And like you said, the same thing. We had situations where you would have to ask for, you know, sanitary napkins, but there would be no officer around. So you would have to go find an officer and then get, you know, a ticket or a disciplinary action for being out of place because you're not where you belong, because you needed something. Not something that I wanted. It wasn't to make a phone call or to go, you know, to the rec room. Something that you needed for your health. And you don't have that access.
And thanks for sharing that, because, I mean, we live in a male-dominated society, and I could just imagine how insensitive males can be to the experiences of women, particularly inside of a correctional facility. And so I admire you and all of you who fought to say, I remember talking to women about toilet tissue. It's like they give us the same amount of toilet tissue they give the men. It's like, no, there's a need that's different. And so, again, generally when you think, well, men might not empathize with that, and so you brought about an awareness that is really needed and that needs to continue to happen in our society. So how do we go about, again, reuniting families? Because you had to be reunited with your families. And what do you think are the best, you know, ways to do this for someone who has criminal justice system involvement?
Right. So again, being away for 20 years, we're talking about an 8-year-old who's now going into her late 20s, early 30s, and my son, who was 2 years old, who is now a grown man. And so I can remember returning back to society and trying to create that bond again. Well, the bond extends out because you still try to hold on to it while you're incarcerated. So I got involved with every program that was available to keep that, you know, family connection together. I went on trailer visits, you know, where you're able to spend 2 and 3 days with your family. You know, I did tapings and I sent out books to my kids, and I made sure that I wrote letters, and, you know, the phone calls, again, they had to be paid for from home, but you want to talk to your kids, so you're calling all the time. So thank God I did have that. So I was able to use that to hold on to the connection that I had with my son and my daughter. So when I came home, we already had that strong sense of connection. So it wasn't as difficult as I've seen with like some of my clients or some of the women who've come home prior to me, where they don't have that connection, where the connection was broken, even from inside. So to come out now and to try to get that back. When you left and went to prison, you had small children. Now you came home, you have grown men and women. They don't want to hear it. They're not 1 and 2 years old anymore. So you can't just come home and make it look like you were just gone yesterday when you were gone for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So it can be very difficult.
Got it. Thank you. And Brittany, any
I think that Sharon's right. From my experience, obviously, like I said, I don't have children, but they did have trailer visits, and they allowed you to make those videos or read for me, mommy programs. And I think that in terms of maintaining that bond and decarcerating families after, it's important to have those type of the access to those things while you're in prison, because how do you keep that bond strong if you're not able to interact or engage with your family. We used to have family picnic days, and I used to wish that I could like have my nephew come or my niece come, because I have 6 sisters and I'm really close to my sisters, and all but one have children. And at the time, I, lived with sisters, so I was raised around their children. It wasn't like, oh, I don't know my nieces and nephews. I was really close to my niece and nephews. And it was really hard because I would speak to them on the phone too, and the question was always, well, when are you coming home? So that, I think, is a major key, is maintaining those relationships while you're there. But I also remember, so my mom was also in prison while I was younger. So I remember being that child where my mother wasn't there and she was gone for a while. And I remember the resentment and the anger because those bonds didn't last while she was in prison. And when she was released, for me, it was easy, I guess. That resentment went away immediately. Like, I was mad at her while she was gone. When she came back, I was just happy that she was back, so all of that was irrelevant. It was just like, my mom's here, I love her.
Exactly.
It is what it is. She did what she did. Mistakes are made. People are people. And even as a child, I embraced her more than I kind of kept on with that anger and resentment. But what are we doing to kind of facilitate that? I think it does need to start in prison, because if those bonds break in prison, it's really hard to continue that relationship once the woman leaves.
And I want to say that, when you're incarcerated, your whole family is incarcerated. You become almost like a selfish individual because you want those visits, you want your kids to come, you want your family to come. But each time they come, they're exposed to having to be searched. They're exposed to maybe an officer having a bad day. They're exposed to maybe something going on in the facility and they have to stand outside in the cold for maybe an hour or two. Or they may be exposed to not even getting in at all. But we want that bond, we want that visit, we want that connection, and so we thrive on it, and we almost make demands on our families to have that, and it's almost like unhealthy, but at the same time, without it, what are you gonna do?
I mean, and it dispels a lot of the myths, though, about how much someone that's in prison or in jail wants to continue to remain involved with family. Some people think, oh, this person went to jail, this person went to prison, this person doesn't want to have much to do with family. And we know that, again, those things need to be debunked in as much as possible, because you're alluding to the fact that you were able to maintain contact with your family members. And what about those instances where family members can't afford to take the trip? A lot of individuals that are incarcerated are already strapped, families living in poverty, and then the families have to bear the burden of travel if they can, and phone calls, sending packages. What do you recommend for families who can't necessarily do those things? How can they continue to keep the family together?
Right, so some of these family members, like children end up in foster care, right? And so then you have a foster parent who's bringing the child up on a visit, right? And that visit doesn't always go well, because here you're sitting with a stranger who has your child is crying, the visit is over, and the kid just wants their mom, and you're forcing this kid to now leave because you have to go. You have the officer intervening saying, come on, visit's over. And so for them to try to maintain, so certain facilities would have certain programs that a person could actually get involved with if they didn't have a family member. But not every facility would have that. So then you would be left at the hands of the system, just maybe not seeing your kid for the next 5, 10 years. And that's just the way it was. But fortunately enough, in my situation, the facility that I was in, a lot of people were able to go to something called the parenting center, where they were able to have their kids come up, stay with a host family, they were picked up, they were taken back home, and so fortunately enough, I did see a lot of that happen.
What about in Massachusetts? What opportunities were available there?
So I actually took the parenting class, but in my experience, there was nothing like that. So they did have the house. It was a beautiful house. I remember I worked maintenance, so I got to see the inside of it. But it was the responsibility of your family to bring your child to see you, and to come pick you up at a certain time, have that emergency information on ready to go, and all of that. But outside of that, there wasn't anything. And even from my experience, visiting my mother in Albion, if you want to go, it like the bus situation. So I don't drive, and I had to take the bus, and it was such a process that after the 24-hour process, it's discouraging. And while there were no issues there, no, not like I've experienced at Rikers, where it's such a process getting in there, and even that is such a hassle. That, but afterwards, it's like, I don't want to do this again. And you push yourself because of the people that you love. But like I had previously said to you, Ron, when I went on the visit, and Albion is the last stop on the bus, and I'm the only person getting off, I looked around and I was like, you know, these are mothers and grandmothers and aunts and sisters, and no one is coming here to see them. The visiting room didn't have a lot of people, and I understand the travel is difficult. So what are we doing, like you said, I wonder what programs we could offer to help kind of facilitate that reunification while you're in prison. Maybe some type of busing service where, you know, we'll make sure that you get there at an affordable price. Because even the bus, I want to say it was like $70 or so. Which may not necessarily be the most affordable for some people to just say, hey, I have $70 to go visit this person. And then while you're on the visit, you also want to, you know, get them something to eat, or you're going to be on this visit for 4 or 5 hours. You're going to want something, you know. What are we doing to help those relationships grow? And I don't think that we're doing anything. In Massachusetts, definitely nothing was done. And I can't really speak to how much is done in New York, but from my own personal experience with my mom, like, I didn't see any of it. It was make the arrangements yourself, get there yourself, and work it out.
Yeah. And I recall talking to someone, a gentleman who was married to a woman who was incarcerated, and Brittany and I had a conversation, and he said when I would go on a visit, there would rarely be men in the visiting room. And so to Brittany's point, that a lot of the folks that were on the bus were going to the men's facility, and whenever that's possible, when families can afford to do that. But it's like, wow, you have the increase in women going to prison, and it's like not a lot of folks were actually going to visit them. So it's really, you know, it's a traumatic experience. You know, the things that you mentioned already. So, but I wanted to ask, do you have policy recommendations? What is it that really needs to change in order to ensure that that we decarcerate, right, this system? And we only have like around 5 minutes or so left.
Keep it short.
So I want to, try to, what is it that you're working on that you think needs to happen?
So I think that, like, the agency that I work at, Steps to End Family Violence, and we're also affiliated with the coalition at the Women's Prisons Association, and they're working on a bill called the DVSJS, you know, which is the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act bill. And so people need to just get involved and be able to go up to talk to the legislators in Albany. You can get a training through the Corrections Association. They do it all. And just be a part of getting on that bus. Be a part of the passion. Be driven. Don't just talk about it. Be about it. You know, get up early in the morning and go and ride up with people who have a story to tell, to allow people to hear these stories, see the passion, and know that, you know, these families are serious about changing the laws and putting new policies in place so that the families can be able to reap the good benefits of a person who may be, you know, incarcerated and suffering at the hands of the criminal justice system.
Exactly. And you work at Fortune. You know, we're involved in a lot. We're trying to, you know, we've been at the hashtag Close Rikers meetings. We've been, you know, involved in, you know, meeting with folks from the State Department of Corrections, community supervisions, all over, and talking about how we can, you know, bring down our incarceration rates while also continuing to keep crime rates relatively low. You know, what do you think, Brittany, about some policies?
Absolute fan of our Alternatives to Incarceration program. Even looking at my own case, I remember looking at comparatively to New York, I would not probably have gotten a prison sentence that I got in New York that I got in Massachusetts just because of different laws, and I had a mandatory sentence. What types of alternatives to incarceration are we offering, and are we offering enough? So I took my students to the last ATI Coalition rally because I felt like it was important for them to advocate for themselves and see that, you know, it's because of programs like this that you're able to remain with your family and out of prison. And I feel like too often the answer is prison and incarceration, and it definitely stems from one, lack of funding for programs like ours. We're always looking for funding, right? And even with somewhere around $1 million, they said the coalition had gotten recently. I think we need more programs that are focused on one, alternatives to incarceration, but we also need to address the issues that are causing the incarceration, the educational gap, the achievement gap, the socioeconomic concerns that we have. What are we doing to address poverty right now? There are compounding issues that we're all very aware of.
Absolutely.
And we have to take care of those because until we give people access to resources, we're going to have an issue with incarceration.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that. I mean, incarceration can't be the default, right?
Right.
We really are concerned about public safety, then we need to look at whether or not it's necessary that someone goes to prison. And in so many cases, we've determined that it's not. So I just want to...
And for the length of time.
And for the length of time. So
Yeah.
on the back end,
Yeah.
I mean, were you hit at the parole board?
No, well, yes and no, because
Okay.
I had one of those cases where I went to the parole board and they hit me with 2 years,
Yes.
and then they ended up having me come back because they made a mistake in my paperwork, and then I ended up getting out.
Okay.
You know, but after all I had done,
Yes.
and just being sentenced to that 20 years and knowing that I had finally made it to that
Yeah.
door, the door was still closed.
Exactly.
They
Yeah.
still had the opportunity to keep me there, even with
Exactly.
all the great things that I had done.
Exactly. So, I mean, this has been an amazing conversation. I want to thank you both for your excellent, sharing of your stories. And I think our audience is really, as I am, satisfied and delighted that you were able to be with us. So, thank you to our guests, Brittany Smith and Sharon Richardson, for joining us on both sides of the bars. And thank you in TV Land for joining us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Ronald Day as we critically look at both sides of the bars.